The morning of June 4, 1942, 10:24 hours. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching the first Zero fighter accelerate down the flight deck. Within 5 minutes, 89 aircraft would be airborne, armed, and fueled for a counter-strike against the American fleet lurking somewhere beyond the horizon. The big ship turned into the wind, engines warming, pilots ready. Then a lookout screamed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Fuchida looked up. 3 black silhouettes plummeting from 9,000 feet. The plump shapes of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers growing larger with each second. Anti-aircraft guns fired frantic bursts, too late. Black objects floated eerily from the aircraft wings. Then the first bomb struck. What happened in the next 12 minutes on the morning of June 4th would not just change the course of a single battle. It would end Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific, kill over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators, and eliminate 4 fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. But the numbers don't capture what made those 12 minutes so devastating. It wasn't just that the Japanese lost. It was that they saw it coming. They knew exactly what was about to happen. And they had 12 minutes to stop it. 12 minutes that might as well have been 12 seconds. This is the story of how the Battle of Midway was won and lost, not in hours of combat, but in a span of time shorter than it takes to make a cup of coffee. And it's the story of the decisions, the delays, and the brutal mathematics of carrier warfare that made those 12 minutes possible. To understand what happened at 10:24 on June 4th, you have to understand what carrier warfare meant in 1942, not the sanitized version you see in films. The reality, the specific material constraints that governed every decision an admiral made, the precise timing required for flight operations, the physics of launching and recovering aircraft from a moving ship, the fact that every second counted, and most men didn't have enough of them. In June 1942, aircraft carriers represented the most complex and dangerous weapons system ever deployed in naval combat. They were floating air bases, ammunition depots, fuel stations, and command centers all compressed into a hull less than 900 feet long. When they worked, they projected power across hundreds of miles of ocean. When they failed, they died catastrophically. There was no middle ground. The Japanese understood this better than anyone. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the 1st Carrier Striking Force, 4 fleet carriers that represented the finest naval aviation force on Earth. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had fought from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. They'd sunk British battleships, destroyed Allied air power across the Western Pacific, and established Japanese dominance from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific. In every engagement, they'd won decisively. They'd never lost a carrier. They'd never faced a coordinated counterattack. They'd become accustomed to victory. But that confidence masked a critical vulnerability. Japanese carrier doctrine prioritized offensive striking power above everything else. The carriers could throw a devastating punch. They couldn't take one. Their anti-aircraft guns were inadequate. Their damage control procedures were underdeveloped. Their defensive systems had never been tested against massed air attack, because they'd never needed to be. Until Midway. Operation MI, the Japanese plan to capture Midway Atoll and destroy the American carrier fleet, depended on surprise. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, believed the Americans wouldn't discover the Japanese intentions until after Midway had been attacked. He believed American carriers would steam out from Pearl Harbor to defend the atoll. He believed his overwhelming force would catch them in the open ocean and annihilate them. He believed wrong on all 3 counts. American code breakers had broken Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Hawaii had been reading Japanese messages for months. They knew about Midway. They knew the date. They knew the order of battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had time to prepare an ambush. He reinforced Midway's air defenses with every available aircraft. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, 200 miles northeast of the atoll, exactly where Yamamoto's plan assumed no American ships would be. The Japanese sailed into a trap without knowing it, but even perfect intelligence couldn't guarantee victory. The Americans were outnumbered. The Japanese carriers embarked more aircraft. The Zero fighters were superior to American Wildcats. Japanese pilots had more combat experience. Japanese torpedoes actually worked, unlike the defective American weapons. On paper, Nagumo should have won. What changed the equation was timing. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, Zeros, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers took off from the four carriers under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. Their mission was straightforward: destroy Midway's air defenses, eliminate the runways, prepare the atoll for invasion. Nagumo kept half his aircraft in reserve, 93 planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for strikes against American ships. Standard doctrine: you never committed your entire force to one objective until you knew what threats existed. The Midway strike reached the atoll around 6:30. American radar had detected the incoming raid long before it arrived. Marine fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of Wildcats intercepted the Japanese formation 30 miles out. They were slaughtered. The Zeros cut through them with brutal efficiency. More than half the Marine fighters were shot down in minutes. The Japanese continued to their targets. They bombed Midway for 15 minutes, damaging facilities, starting fires, killing personnel. But they didn't destroy the runways. They didn't eliminate the air defenses. Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo around 7 o'clock. There is need for a second attack wave. That message created the first decision point. Nagumo had 93 aircraft spotted below in the hangar decks, armed for attacks on ships. Should he keep them ready for the American fleet that intelligence suggested might be in the area, or should he rearm them with high-explosive bombs for a second Midway strike? The safer choice was obvious. Wait for more reconnaissance data, keep the reserve force ready for naval targets, launch when the American carriers were located. But Nagumo was facing operational pressure from multiple directions. American aircraft from Midway were already attacking his carriers. 6 torpedo-armed TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 bombers came in low and slow at 7:10. They scored no hits, most were shot down, but they forced Nagumo's carriers to take evasive action. They disrupted operations. More attacks followed. Marine dive bombers in obsolete Dauntless and Vindicator aircraft. Army Air Force, B-17 seconds, bombing from 20,000 feet. The attacks were uncoordinated, poorly executed, and completely ineffective. Not one bomb hit a Japanese ship, but each attack consumed time. Each attack forced the carriers to maneuver. Each attack kept Nagumo's combat air patrol busy shooting down American aircraft instead of maintaining defensive stations. And each attack reinforced Nagumo's conviction that Midway needed to be neutralized before he could focus on hunting American carriers. At 7:15, believing he retained surprise and that the American fleet was no closer than Hawaii, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second Midway strike. Torpedoes were to be replaced with bombs. Armor-piercing ordnance was to be switched for high-explosive fragmentation weapons. The work began immediately. Rearming 93 aircraft wasn't a simple process. Each torpedo weighed over 1,800 pounds. Removing them required deck crews to manhandle heavy dollies, disconnect electrical fittings, and lower the weapons to the magazines below. Then they had to bring up the replacement bombs, attach them to the hardpoints, check the fuses, and ensure the arming wires were properly connected. Under ideal conditions, with clear decks and no interruptions, the process took 45 minutes. Nagumo wasn't operating under ideal conditions. At 7:28, just 13 minutes after ordering the rearmament, a delayed reconnaissance aircraft finally reported contact. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 10 enemy surface ships. Location, northeast of Midway. Composition unknown, ship types not disclosed. Nagumo stopped. The report was vague, incomplete, frustrating. 10 ships could mean anything: a destroyer screen, a cruiser patrol, or the American carrier force he'd been expecting. He needed more information. He ordered the scout to maintain contact and clarify what ships he'd found. He halted the rearming operation. The torpedo-equipped aircraft that hadn't yet been touched would stay as they were, ready for anti-ship attacks. The ones already disarmed would have to wait. For 18 minutes, Nagumo waited for clarification while his flight decks and hangar bays descended into organized chaos. Aircraft were scattered across multiple deck levels. Some still had torpedoes, some had bombs, some had neither, suspended in the middle of the rearming process, with ordnance sitting beside them on carts and dollies. At 7:45, the scout reported again. Composition of the force appears to include one carrier. Now, Nagumo knew. The Americans were here. His intelligence had been wrong. His assumptions were wrong. He needed to launch an immediate strike before the Americans could attack his carriers. He ordered the rearming process reversed. The aircraft that had already received bombs were to have those removed and torpedoes reinstalled. The planes that still had torpedoes were to be prepared for immediate launch. But now he faced another problem. Tomonaga's strike aircraft were returning from Midway, over 100 aircraft, many damaged, all low on fuel. If Nagumo launched his reserve strike immediately, those returning aircraft would have nowhere to land. They'd run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. He'd lose over 100 pilots, irreplaceable combat veterans, the most valuable asset in his entire force. Japanese doctrine was absolute on this point. You never sacrificed returning pilots if you could avoid it. Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 aboard Hiryu, disagreed. He sent a message to Nagumo arguing for an immediate attack with whatever aircraft were available. Launch now, even without fighter escort. Accept the risks. Strike before the Americans could organize their own attack. Nagumo refused. He would recover the Midway strike first, complete the rearming, then launch a properly coordinated attack with full fighter escort. The decision was tactically sound. It was also fatal, because while Nagumo's carriers were landing aircraft, refueling them, and attempting to sort out the ordnance chaos on their hangar decks, American dive bombers were already in the air and hunting for their targets. The American attack had not gone according to plan. Nothing about June 4th went according to plan for either side. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, had launched his strike at 7 o'clock that morning, sending off every available aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher on Yorktown had waited, holding his aircraft in reserve until American scouts confirmed the location of all 4 Japanese carriers. The result was a completely uncoordinated attack. Aircraft from 3 carriers, launched at different times, flying at different speeds, heading for targets whose exact location kept changing as the Japanese maneuvered to avoid the Midway-based attacks. The American torpedo bombers arrived first. They'd flown low and slow, unable to climb for fear of depleting their limited fuel. 41 TBD Devastators in 3 separate squadrons, each attacking independently without fighter escort or coordination. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. They came in one after another between 9:20 and 10:20 in the morning. The Japanese slaughtered them. 0 fighters dove through the formations, cannon fire shredding the obsolete Devastators before they could reach launch range. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and screening cruisers created walls of steel that the slow-moving bombers had to fly through. Of 41 aircraft, 35 were destroyed. All 15 of Torpedo 8's planes were shot down. Every pilot killed except Ensign George Gay, who survived being shot down and watched the rest of the battle from a raft in the middle of the Japanese fleet. Not a single torpedo launched by these squadrons found its target. Not one. Every torpedo either missed, ran too deep, or failed to explode. The sacrifice appeared futile, pointless, a waste of trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy who'd demonstrated complete tactical superiority. But the torpedo attacks achieved something the pilots never knew about. They drew Nagumo's combat air patrol down to wave-top altitude. Dozens of Zeros were now at sea level, engines straining, fuel tanks draining, ammunition expended. They'd need to land soon for refueling and rearming. The Japanese carriers had no fighters at altitude, no high cover, no defensive screen against aircraft attacking from above. And at exactly 10:22, while Nagumo's deck crews were still trying to complete the rearming process, while fuel hoses snaked across flight decks refilling tanks on the Midway strike aircraft, while bombs and torpedoes sat on carts in the hangar bays because there hadn't been time to return them to the magazines, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey arrived overhead with 33 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived with 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown. 50 American dive bombers against 4 Japanese carriers caught at the worst possible moment. Fighters at the wrong altitude, decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. No time to launch. No time to clear the flight decks. No time to do anything except watch as the black shapes of American dive bombers rolled into their attack dives from 14,000 feet. Nagumo had just given the order to launch when ready at 10:20. Within 5 minutes, his aircraft would be airborne. 5 minutes that turned into an eternity. At 10:24, the air officer on Akagi's bridge flapped a white flag. The first Zero fighter gathered speed and whizzed off the deck. That's when the lookout screamed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from emergency appendix surgery just days before, stood on the bridge, unable to fly, but watching every moment unfold. He looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting toward Akagi. Some machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts. Too late. The plump silhouettes of the Douglas Dauntless dive bombers grew larger with each second. Then black objects floated eerily from their wings. The first bomb struck the edge of the midship elevator. It penetrated to the upper hangar deck and exploded, among the armed and fueled aircraft parked there. The blast was catastrophic. Planes packed wing to wing ignited instantly. Aviation fuel lines that had been filled for the planned strike ruptured. The fires spread with terrifying speed. A second bomb hit near the port side of the flight deck. The explosions triggered secondary detonations as bombs and torpedoes stacked on carts throughout the hangar began cooking off. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best had delivered that killing blow to Akagi. Just one direct hit. Under normal circumstances, the giant carrier might have survived a single bomb, but these weren't normal circumstances. The flight deck was crowded with aircraft armed and fueled for launch. The hangar deck below was a chaos of ordnance, fuel hoses, and aircraft in various states of rearming. Everything that made a carrier dangerous to enemies made it vulnerable to itself when that carefully organized lethality was disrupted by a single 500-pound bomb. 4 miles away, Kaga was dying even faster. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's squadron from Enterprise had found her at the exact same moment. 9 Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. The first 3 bombs were near misses, sending up geysers of water that drenched the flight deck but caused no damage. Then 4 of the next 6 bombs scored direct hits, forward, middle, and aft sections of the flight deck. Each bomb punched through and exploded in the hangar spaces below. The bomb that struck closest to the bow landed just forward of the bridge, hitting a small gasoline truck parked on the flight deck. The explosion spread fire and death throughout the bridge area instantly. Captain Jisaku Okada died on the spot along with most of his command staff. The carrier's nerve center simply ceased to exist in a flash of flame and shrapnel. Commander Takahisa Amagai, the air officer, became the senior surviving officer. He took command of a ship that was already doomed. Kaga's flight, a deck had been crowded with aircraft preparing for launch. Now those aircraft became bombs themselves. Fuel tanks ruptured, ordnance cooked off. The fires spread faster than damage control parties could respond. Within minutes, the entire forward section of the ship was an inferno. 800 men, 1/3 of Kaga's crew, would die in the next few hours. 5 miles north, Soryu's lookouts finally spotted the danger. They'd been watching Kaga burning when eyes instinctively looked skyward. 13 American planes plummeting down. It was 10:25. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown had found his target. 3 bombs struck in as many minutes. The first blasted the flight deck in front of the forward elevator. The next 2 straddled the amidship elevator, completely wrecking the deck structure. The pattern was identical to what was happening on Akagi and Kaga. Bombs penetrating to the hangar deck, explosions among armed and fueled aircraft, secondary detonations as ordnance ignited, fires spreading faster than they could be contained. Soryu had been caught in the same vulnerable condition as her sister ships. Deck parties had been preparing aircraft for launch. Fuel hoses were connected. Bombs and torpedoes were staged throughout the hangar. Everything needed for a devastating strike against American carriers became the fuel for Soryu's own destruction. The entire attack, from the first bomb striking Akagi to the last bomb hitting Soryu, took approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes that destroyed 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers. 5 minutes that killed thousands of sailors and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. 5 minutes that ended Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. But those 5 minutes were the culmination of decisions and delays stretching back hours. The question everyone asked afterward was simple. How did the Japanese let this happen? The answer lies in understanding what Admiral Nagumo knew and when he knew it. At ATA 2022, 7:40 in the morning, when he first received word that American ships were in the area, he'd immediately halted the rearming process. He'd ordered his reserve aircraft prepared for an anti-ship strike, but he couldn't launch them. The Midway strike aircraft were returning, low on fuel, many damaged. Japanese doctrine was absolute. You recovered your pilots. You didn't sacrifice 100 combat veterans to launch an immediate attack. So Nagumo began landing aircraft at 8 o'clock, one at a time. The process couldn't be rushed. Each aircraft had to be trapped by the arresting wires, pulled clear of the landing area, and taxied to a parking spot. Damaged aircraft took longer. Some crashed on landing and had to be pushed overboard to clear the deck. The entire evolution consumed over an hour. By 9:30, all the Midway strike aircraft were aboard. Now Nagumo could focus on preparing his counterattack, but the rearming was incomplete. Half the reserve aircraft still had bombs instead of torpedoes. They needed to be switched back. The process would take another 45 minutes. Nagumo ordered it done. Between 9:30 and 10:20, while his carriers were rearming and refueling, American torpedo bombers attacked. 3 separate waves, 41 aircraft in total. The attacks were poorly coordinated and completely unsuccessful, but they forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver continuously. They kept the combat air patrol engaged at low altitude. They disrupted deck operations. Every time a carrier had to turn to evade torpedoes, the rearming process slowed. Every time fighters had to be launched to intercept attackers, it delayed the strike preparation. The Americans were buying time without knowing it. The sacrifice of those torpedo bomber crews was creating a window measured in minutes. Minutes that Wade McCluskey and his dive bombers desperately needed. McCluskey had launched from Enterprise at 7 o'clock that morning with 33 Dauntless dive bombers. He'd flown to where intelligence said the Japanese carriers would be. They weren't there. Nagumo had changed course to avoid the Midway-based attacks and to close with the reported American carrier position. McCluskey had a choice: return to Enterprise with his bombs or continue searching with fuel running critically low. He chose to search. At 9:55, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast, the Arashi. She'd been detached to hunt for the American submarine Nautilus. Now she was rejoining the carrier force. McCluskey followed her wake. At 10:20, he found what he'd been searching for: 4 Japanese carriers in a loose formation. Zeros swarming at low altitude, flight decks crowded with aircraft. He rolled into his attack dive at 10:22. The timing was perfect by accident. McCluskey hadn't coordinated with Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers. They'd launched at different times, flown different routes, and arrived at the target independently. But both squadrons hit at almost exactly the same moment. 50 dive bombers attacking from different angles, overwhelming the Japanese defenses. catching the carriers at their most vulnerable point. The Japanese had no time to react. Their fighters were at the wrong altitude. Their anti-aircraft fire was ineffective against aircraft diving at 70 degrees from 14,000 feet. The few Zeros that did manage to climb couldn't reach attack altitude before the dive bombers released and pulled out. The American pilots executed their attacks with brutal precision. They'd trained for exactly this scenario. The Dauntless dive bomber had been designed for carrier strikes. It could dive at near vertical angles while remaining stable. Perforated dive brakes allowed pilots to control their descent speed. The bomb sight was simple but effective. Point the nose at the target, hold it steady, release at the designated altitude. The pilots released between 1,800 and 2,000 feet, low enough for accuracy, high enough to clear their own bomb blasts. Norman Dusty Kleiss, flying from Enterprise, scored a direct hit on Kaga's flight deck. His bomb struck near the island superstructure, starting fires that would consume the ship. He was one of 3 pilots to score multiple hits during the battle, the only pilot to achieve 3 direct hits over 2 days of combat. His perspective from the cockpit captured what the moment felt like. As he pulled away from the Japanese fleet, he kicked rudder and looked back at his target. Kaga was undergoing a series of explosions that utterly eviscerated the ship, exposing her innards like some disemboweled animal. The bomb damage itself wasn't necessarily fatal. American bombs in 1942 were smaller than they'd become later in the war, 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds, enough to penetrate a wooden flight deck and explode in the hangar below, but not necessarily enough to sink a carrier outright. What made the bombs catastrophic was what they hit. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught with their flight decks and hangar decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, bombs stacked on carts waiting to be loaded, torpedoes sitting on dollies, aviation fuel lines pressurized and flowing. When American bombs penetrated to the hangar decks, they didn't just damage the ships. They ignited floating ammunition depots. The fires spread with horrifying speed. Aviation fuel burns hot and fast. High-octane gasoline creates fireballs that consume everything in their path. The Japanese damage control parties fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed. Each secondary explosion made the situation worse. Each ruptured fuel line fed the inferno. Each bomb that cooked off in the hangar sent shrapnel through bulkheads and started new fires. Within 15 minutes of being hit, all 3 carriers were burning out of control. The fires reached temperatures that warped steel deck plates and melted aluminum aircraft frames. Explosions continued for hours as ordnance cooked off. Men trapped below decks faced choices between burning alive and jumping into an ocean that might be 500 feet below them by the time they hit the water. Commander Fuchida, still on Akagi's bridge when the bombs hit, later described the horror. He looked around at destruction wrought in seconds. There was a huge hole in the flight deck just behind the amidship elevator. The elevator itself, twisted like molten glass, was drooping into the hangar. Deck plates reeled upward in grotesque configurations. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flames and jet-black smoke, making it impossible to bring the fires under control. The bridge itself became untenable. Smoke from the burning hangar gushed through passageways. The heat was unbearable. Officers tried to maintain command, but the situation was hopeless. When flames blocked the exits, they evacuated down a rope from the bridge to the deck below. Fuchida, injured and unable to move quickly, was helped by sailors who got him out just before the bridge area became fully engulfed. As he slid down the rope, an explosion threw him to the deck and broke both his ankles. He survived. Thousands didn't. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from the others and escaped the initial attack. She was positioned several miles northwest of the main carrier group. American dive bombers hadn't found her. For a few hours, she represented Japan's only remaining striking power. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, who'd urged Nagumo to attack immediately that morning, now launched his own counterstrikes. At 10:45, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters took off from Hiryu hunting for American carriers. They found Yorktown just after noon. The attack was professionally executed. 3 bombs struck the carrier. Damage was severe but not fatal. Yorktown's damage control parties had her operational again within hours. Hiryu launched a second strike at 1:30 in the afternoon. This time torpedo bombers. They hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes on her port side. The carrier began listing heavily. By 3 o'clock, her captain ordered abandon ship. She stayed afloat for days, but would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine. But Hiryu's counterattacks, while successful, sealed her own fate. American scout planes from Yorktown had located her during the morning battle. At 3:30 in the afternoon, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu steaming alone, her escorts scattered, her combat air patrol depleted. They attacked at 5 o'clock. 4 bombs hit. The pattern repeated. Bombs penetrating to the hangar deck. Fires igniting among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions consuming the ship. By evening, Hiryu was a burning wreck. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. He was last seen standing on the bridge as flames consumed the carrier. Hiryu sank in the early morning hours of June 5th. In less than 12 hours, Japan had lost all 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the same carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, gone, along with hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The material losses were staggering, but the real damage went deeper than steel and aviation gasoline. Those 12 minutes on the morning of June 4th shattered something fundamental about Japanese naval aviation. They revealed that the carriers everyone believed were invincible could be destroyed in minutes if caught at the wrong moment. They demonstrated that American pilots, flying American aircraft, with American tactics, could defeat the force that had seemed unstoppable since December 1941. The Japanese had gone into Midway expecting another easy victory. They'd prepared for a battle on their terms, against an enemy who'd already been written off as defeated. Instead, they'd ambushed, outmaneuvered, and destroyed by pilots who'd been told for months that Japanese Zeros were superior, that Japanese training was better, that American aircraft couldn't compete. The myth of invincibility died with those 4 carriers. What haunted Japanese officers afterward wasn't just the defeat, it was how close they'd come to avoiding it. At 10:20, when Nagumo gave the order to launch, his carriers had been minutes from getting aircraft airborne. If the American dive bombers had arrived 10 minutes later, they'd have found empty flight decks and a Japanese strike heading toward the American carriers. If the torpedo bomber attacks had been delayed by 30 minutes, Nagumo would have completed his rearming and launched before the dive bombers appeared. If McCluskey hadn't spotted that destroyer and followed its wake, he might never have found the Japanese carriers at all. The battle turned on minutes, on chances, on decisions made under incomplete information with time running out. Nagumo made reasonable choices based on what he knew. Recover the returning pilots, complete the rearming, launch a coordinated strike. Every decision was tactically sound, but tactics don't win battles when timing works against you. And on June 4th, timing was everything. The Americans had attacked piecemeal, uncoordinated, with obsolete aircraft and defective weapons. They'd lost dozens of pilots, achieving nothing but drawing down the Japanese combat air patrol. Then, by chance or providence, or the strange mathematics of naval warfare, the dive bombers arrived at exactly the right moment, 5 minutes either direction, and the battle might have ended differently, but it didn't. And in those 12 minutes from 10:20 to 10:32, when American bombs were falling and Japanese carriers were burning, the Pacific War changed forever. Part 3, The Cost of Truth, Aftermath and Legacy. Soryu sank first, at 7:20 in the Legacy. Evening on June 4th. Her fires had burned out of control all afternoon. Secondary explosions had blown holes in her hull below the waterline. When she finally went under, she took 711 men with her. Kaga followed 5 minutes later at 7:25. The giant carrier had been one of Japan's first purpose-built fleet carriers, converted from a battleship hull in the 1920s. She'd served at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and throughout the conquest of the Western Pacific. Now she slipped beneath the waves with over 800 crew still aboard. Akagi stayed afloat through the night. Damage control parties fought the fires for hours, but the blaze had spread too deep into the ship's structure. By dawn, on June 5th, Admiral Nagumo finally accepted what everyone already knew. The flagship was lost. A Japanese destroyer delivered the coup de grace with torpedoes at sunrise. Akagi sank with her battle flag still flying. Commander Fuchida, evacuated to a cruiser, watched his ship disappear beneath the Pacific. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, the ship he'd flown from for years, gone. Hiryu burned through the night of June 4th. Admiral Yamaguchi had refused evacuation, choosing to remain aboard as the fires consumed his flagship. The carrier finally sank at 9 in the morning on June 5th. By then, the Battle of Midway was essentially over. The Japanese fleet, having lost all 4 fleet carriers, withdrew to the west. Admiral Yamamoto briefly considered bringing his battleships forward for a night surface action, hoping to engage and destroy the American carriers with superior firepower. But Admiral Spruance, commanding the American task force after Fletcher's Yorktown had been disabled, refused to take the bait. He kept his carriers out of range, maintaining the advantage his dive bombers had won. There would be no second battle. The Americans pursued cautiously on June 5th and 6th. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found Japanese cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, both damaged in a collision during the night withdrawal. They attacked repeatedly over 2 days. Mikuma sank on June 6th, her hull torn apart by multiple bomb hits. The attacks proved that American dive bomber accuracy wasn't a fluke. Given time to coordinate their attacks and find isolated targets, the Dauntless crews could deliver devastating precision strikes. Yorktown remained afloat through June 5th and 6th. Salvage crews worked desperately to save her, managing to reduce her list and restore some basic systems. For a moment, it seemed the tough carrier might survive. Then, on June 6th, Japanese submarine I-168 found her. The submarine commander lined up a perfect shot and fired 4 torpedoes. 3 hit Yorktown, 1 hit the destroyer Hamon, secured alongside. Hamon broke in half and sank immediately, taking 80 men with her. Yorktown survived for several more hours, finally capsizing and sinking on the morning of June 7th. She took with her 141 crew who'd been killed during the air attacks on June 4th. When the casualty reports were compiled, the numbers told a stark story. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 348 aircraft, and 3,057 personnel killed. More importantly, they'd lost 110 trained pilots. These weren't rookie aviators fresh from training. These were combat veterans who'd fought since the war's beginning, men who'd perfected their skills over years of service. Japan's training pipeline couldn't replace them. The United States had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. The exchange rate wasn't even close. But numbers alone don't capture what Midway meant for the Pacific War. The battle wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a strategic turning point that changed the fundamental balance of power in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative. They chose where and when to attack. They controlled the pace of operations. They could project power across thousands of miles of ocean with confidence. After Midway, that capability was gone. The loss of 4 fleet carriers meant Japan no longer had enough striking power to conduct offensive carrier operations. They could defend. They could react. But they couldn't seize new objectives or threaten American bases without risking their remaining carriers in battles they couldn't afford to lose. The Americans understood this immediately. Within 2 months, they launched the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. It succeeded because Japan couldn't bring sufficient carrier aviation to bear. Their remaining carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were tied down protecting the home islands and supporting defensive operations. Japan fought at Guadalcanal with land-based aircraft operating at the edge of their range. The Americans fought with carrier task forces that could be repositioned as needed. The difference was decisive. What made Japan's situation desperate wasn't just the loss of the carriers themselves, It was the impossibility of replacing them quickly enough to matter. American shipyards were already building fleet carriers by the dozen. Essex-class carriers, improved designs incorporating lessons from combat, began joining the fleet in 1943. By 1944, the United States had more carriers than Japan had ever possessed at peak strength. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway. Industrial capacity was limited. Resources were scarce. Trained pilots took years to develop, and the training program couldn't keep pace with losses. By late 1942, Japan was already falling behind in the carrier aviation arms race. By 1943, the gap was unbridgeable. Senior Japanese officers recognized this immediately. Documents recovered after the war show that staff officers began discussing negotiated peace options as early as mid-1942. They understood that conventional military victory was no longer possible. The mathematics didn't work. For every carrier Japan destroyed, America produced 3 more. For every pilot Japan killed, America trained 2 replacements. The attrition rates were unsustainable. Each battle, even when Japan inflicted significant casualties, left them proportionally weaker because they couldn't absorb losses the way America could. The captured intelligence documents told an even grimmer story. Japanese analysts studying American industrial production realized that carrier construction was accelerating, not slowing. New aircraft designs were entering service regularly. The technological gap was widening. Japan's newest fighters, the few that reached production, were barely competitive with American designs from 1943. American fighters from 1944 and 45 would be completely superior. There was no catching up, no brilliant tactical innovation that would close the gap. The material superiority was too overwhelming. This knowledge created a psychological crisis in Japanese military planning. The entire war strategy had been based on winning a short, decisive conflict before American industrial power could be brought to bear. Midway proved that window had closed. The war would be long. It would be attritional. And Japan would lose because they lacked the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged warfare against an enemy that could produce ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than they could be destroyed. Some Japanese officers advocated for immediate peace negotiations. Others pushed for a final decisive battle, one massive engagement that would inflict such catastrophic losses on American forces that negotiations might become possible. These debates occurred against the backdrop of Midway's lessons sitting on desks in Tokyo. Physical proof that Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity made conventional victory impossible. By 1945, the strategic situation had become apocalyptic. Japan had approximately 5,000 aircraft remaining. Most were obsolete. Many were grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. American forces approaching Okinawa could call on thousands of carrier aircraft plus land-based air power from captured island bases. The ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was terminal. Japan's response was the kamikaze program, deliberate suicide attacks using pilots with minimal training flying obsolete aircraft. The tactic was born from desperation. When you can't compete with enemy technology or numbers, you make every attack count by ensuring hits through suicide. The mathematics were brutal but logical. 1 plane, 1 ship, no wasted bombs, no missed attacks. The kamikaze campaign sank dozens of American ships and killed thousands of sailors. But it couldn't change the outcome. America simply built more ships and continued advancing. The final irony is that Japanese officers understood exactly why they were losing. Captured documents show detailed analyses of American tactical innovations, industrial capacity, and strategic planning. Japanese intelligence officers wrote comprehensive reports explaining that defeat was inevitable, given the disparity in resources and production. Understanding the problem didn't provide solutions. Some problems, once you understand them fully, reveal themselves to be unsolvable with available resources. Japan faced exactly that situation. The Battle of Midway stands as perhaps the clearest example in military history of how wars are decided by factors beyond individual courage or tactical skill. Japanese pilots at Midway were brave, well-trained, and flying good aircraft. American pilots were equally brave, but flying in many cases obsolete aircraft with defective weapons. The difference wasn't individual quality. It was timing, intelligence, and the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare, backed by overwhelming industrial capacity. Those 12 minutes on June 4th demonstrated that carrier battles were won by whoever struck first with sufficient force. The Japanese had believed they were invincible because they'd always struck first. At Midway, the Americans struck first, and in 12 minutes, 4 carriers died. The lesson was absorbed by both sides. American carrier doctrine for the rest of the war emphasized speed of strike, get aircraft airborne fast, hit the enemy before they could hit you, accept risks to achieve speed. The tactics that emerged from Midway, combined with improved aircraft and radar, made American carrier task forces into the most lethal naval weapons ever deployed. The Japanese never recovered the capability to threaten American carrier operations again. They fought defensive battles. They conducted suicide attacks. They tried to preserve their remaining carriers for a final decisive engagement that never came. By the war's end, Japan's carrier force had been completely destroyed, not in a single battle like Midway, but in a series of attritional engagements that ground down their aviation strength until nothing remained. The human cost of those 12 minutes extended far beyond the 3,000 men who died on June 4th. The battle's outcome made the Pacific War longer and bloodier than it might have been if Japan had achieved their objectives at Midway. The subsequent campaigns at Guadalcanal, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. The strategic bombing campaign that burned Japanese cities killed tens of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 people. All of this flowed from the fact that Japan couldn't force a negotiated peace after Midway because they'd lost the strategic initiative and never regained it. This doesn't mean Midway caused all subsequent bloodshed. Wars are complex, and attributing causation is always fraught. But the battle eliminated Japan's ability to threaten American naval operations in the Central Pacific, which made the subsequent American advance possible, which led to the island-hopping campaign, which brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, which led directly to the firebombing campaign and ultimately the decision to use atomic weapons. The chain of causation runs through those 12 minutes, when American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Veterans of the battle on both sides spent decades trying to explain what happened and why. American accounts emphasized the courage of the torpedo bomber crews who sacrificed themselves to draw down Japanese fighters. They highlighted Wade McCluskey's decision to continue searching when fuel was running low. They pointed to the exceptional timing that brought dive bombers overhead exactly when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. Japanese accounts focused on Admiral Nagumo's decisions. The delayed reconnaissance, the choice to recover aircraft before launching a counterattack, the repeated rearming orders that left carriers crowded with fuel and ordnance. Both sides struggled to explain how such a decisive result came from such chaotic circumstances. The truth is that Midway wasn't decided by any single decision or mistake. It was the accumulated weight of dozens of small factors, each insignificant by itself, that combined to create that 12-minute window. The delayed Japanese scout plane that found American ships hours late, the sacrifice of American torpedo bombers that pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level, McCluskey's decision to keep searching, the destroyer Arashi leading American aircraft directly to the Japanese carriers, the timing that brought 3 dive bomber squadrons overhead within minutes of to leave to each other. Remove any one of these factors, and the battle might have ended differently, but they all happened, and for 12 minutes on the morning of June 4th, 1942, American dive bombers had clear shots at Japanese carriers caught with armed aircraft and fuel on their decks. They took those shots, they hit their targets, and in doing so, they changed the course of the Pacific War. The admirals who survived Midway understood they'd witnessed something unprecedented. A battle decided not by battleship guns or prolonged surface action, but by aircraft attacking from beyond visual range. A battle where victory went to whoever struck first with concentrated force. A battle where timing mattered more than numbers. These lessons shaped naval warfare for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.